Good afternoon, and thank you for joining me. My name is Simon Richards. I'm the Chair's Development Manager for the National Governance Association, and I work on the Inspiring Governance Service and Future Chairs. I hope you're looking forward to this webinar, and I'm going to try and make it as interactive as I can. So I hope you're sitting comfortably, have a refreshing drink with you, and through the wonders of modern technology, I join you this afternoon from a very sunny Isle of Wight. It's a glorious afternoon here, and I'm looking forward to enjoying the sun when the day has finished today. So as I said, I work on inspiring governance, and that means that today we're going to be talking about governor recruitment, connecting and recruiting volunteers to join your board. As I said, we're going to make this as interactive as we can. So if you think of questions as we go through the webinar, please use the question function that hopefully you can see somewhere on your screen. It might be different depending on what device you're on. Please type in your questions and submit them, and I've allocated some time at the end, and we'll see if we can deal with some of your questions at the end of the webinar. And if we don't get to do all of them, then we will make sure that there is a written response that goes out at some point, probably next week, because it'll take us a little bit of time just to type them up. There are a couple of polls through the webinar as well, so I'd really appreciate if you would take part in those, because they're a very important part of how we go about doing the webinar. So with no further ado, I can get the slide to advance. There we go. So the purpose of this webinar is to assist governing boards to adapt their recruitment strategy to operate in a virtual environment, to reinforce the principles of effective governor recruitment practice, because they still apply, and to provide some practical hints and tips on conducting virtual interviews. Hopefully by the end of this webinar, you will be able to design a governor recruitment strategy that is adapted to operate in a virtual environment. You'll feel a bit more confident about conducting governor interviews virtually, and you'll be able to organise governor development using online resources. Okay, so before we go any further, I'd just like to launch the first of our two polls. If I click in the right place. So this one is just to find out where you're up to with governor recruitment, and this should now be appearing on your screen. So I'd appreciate if you would pick one of the options and vote in the poll. From my own perspective, on my board, I do chair a primary school board in a maintained school in Birmingham, and at the time that not so much the lockdown, but as we saw the impact of coronavirus having an impact on daily lives, governors decided to suspend going to school, and as we had a meeting coming up where we were going to have a couple of candidates joining us just to see how we do our particular style of governance, and it was decided to postpone that meeting while we worked out how to do it virtually. And at the time we thought it was a little bit too much for us to take on doing a virtual meeting for the first time and having candidates to observe how we go about that. So we put a hold on that at the time, and we're working out how we're going to pick that up again, because we think it's important that we keep going with that. We've got a couple of vacancies that we need to fill. And I would be ticking also, we've had governor resignations as a result of COVID-19. We did have one resignation at that time, so that was a little bit disappointing. Okay, so we're still collecting responses according to that, so I'm going to give you a few more seconds. It's still creeping up. Okay, I got up to 80% voted, so we're going to close it there. Let's have a quick look at the results there. So just under half have said we have suspended all governor recruitment. That's perfectly understandable. Half have said we are midway through recruitment, and I hope that means that you're trying to find a way forward, and hopefully that's why you joined this webinar. 2% said we've had governor resignations, and 2% said we have conducted a virtual interview. So that's good to hear that somebody at least has been able to conduct a virtual interview. Okay, so thank you for taking part in the poll. So I'm going to talk about governor recruitment in relation to a fairly typical recruitment cycle. Starting at the top with evaluate, and you probably see this sort of cycle across a number of different sectors and industries, so it's fairly typical. So we start with evaluate, move through recruit, appoint, induct, and develop. And I'm going to look at each of those 5 steps in turn and just consider how they might be changed by operating in a virtual world and the restrictions that we're operating under at the moment. So thinking about evaluation, what are we evaluating? We could be evaluating board composition. Have we got the right mix of governors? If it's a maintained school, do we need to reconstitute? If it's the board of trustees or an LGB, here's some changes to articles of association need to be made to make the board composition more relevant. Board dynamics as well in terms of personalities and mix of power. Governance skills and experience is always well worth keeping under review and evaluation, and board effectiveness. So how do we go about that? What tools have we got? Well, there are a number of tools, most of which are available through the NGA. So there's a skills audit, there's a self-evaluation. We do have an online self-evaluation tool, a board-to-board peer review. I think that generally looks like 2 boards working together and each joining their counterparts, meeting to observe their governance in action. And whilst that might seem a little bit cumbersome in a virtual world, perhaps it can still be done. Maybe not all the board can join their counterparts meeting, but perhaps it's still possible to do some sort of peer review in a virtual world. An external review of governance, again, I don't see why that can't be done virtually. The APPG 20 questions, and that's the all-party parliamentary group on governance. There's 21 formats, and you can find those questions on the NGA website. And a 360 degree of chair performance. And I mention that one because chair performance and reviewing that isn't just about the individual, it is about the whole board. And if you refer to the graphic on that slide, those are the 8 elements of effective governance, something the NGA has been using for a number of years now. And the central pointer is pointing directly at good chairing. Because I work on future chairs, I often say that I think good chairing is the most important of the 8 elements, because a good chair will make sure the other 7 are in place. And using the 8 elements can be another way of evaluating your board effectiveness and moving forward in terms of how you're going to approach governor recruitment. So let's think about recruitment. Where do you start? Well, I'd say that the best place to start, doesn't matter whether you're doing this face-to-face or virtually, is in defining the role. And there's lots of tools and examples out there that you can use, and you will find a model role description of governor on the NGA website. So the 3 core functions are still valid, those haven't gone away. So that's a good place to start. You might be explaining to potential candidates that to start with, they'll be attending meetings virtually, and they will probably be required to attend some online training. The legal restrictions around who can and cannot be a governor still apply, and there's also a need for a DBS check, and I'll touch on DBS checks a bit later on. In terms of attracting candidates, Inspiring Governance, well, it's an online platform, so it is incredibly well suited to recruiting governors in a virtual environment, and I'll talk about Inspiring Governance in a bit more detail in a second. Social media, we can still use social media. It does appear to become a more important method of communication than even it was in terms of how people can communicate with each other in a lockdown scenario. So Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, I think are still valid ways of linking and connecting with people who might want to be school governors. Your school website can still be used to advertise your vacancies. Word of mouth, we're not talking necessarily in the same way, we're not meeting in the same way, but word of mouth still can be quite a powerful tool in terms of identifying potential candidates for your vacancies. And there are still generic volunteering websites such as doit.org that are still operating to provide a platform for people to find volunteering opportunities. The other thing I'd mention is that at the moment there does appear, and you might not agree with this, but I think there does appear in the media to be a greater sense of community spirit and people wanting to contribute to their community. And I think that's something to capitalise on and take advantage of. There has been an enormous response to the requirement and the request for people to volunteer to help support the NHS. Not everybody's going to be able to do that. Not everybody's going to want to do that, and potentially school governance can provide an alternative way for people to give back to their community at a time when maybe they're not working as much as they were, or they've got different commitments and they can give back in a different way. The other thing I would also highlight, which I think we found quite surprising, is that I spoke to an associate from Inspiring Governance a couple of days ago, who told me that since the lockdown had started, we've seen just over 100 new sign-ups to Inspiring Governance for volunteers, which is an indicator, whilst that's a lot less than it used to be, it is, I think, an indicator that people are still interested in being school governors, and they are continuing to sign up, so that there is still a growing database on Inspiring Governance of people wanting to find schools. And the other thing that we've been doing, the regional managers for Inspiring Governance has been contacting volunteers to offer them the opportunity, if they wish, to suspend temporarily their account so they don't get requests from schools. And they've been surprised at people who have said, oh, no, I still want to pursue this, I'm still interested in talking to schools. And some of those people have been in what appears to be an essential service or even a key worker role, and they're still interested. So I think the message there is avoid generalizations about any perceptions you might have about circumstances. Everybody's different, and if they're showing interest, then it's worth talking to them. So let's have a quick look at Inspiring Governance. I'm hoping that you've heard of this or even familiar with it. Inspiring Governance is a free online recruitment service which connects people, volunteers interested in becoming governors and trustees with those schools that need them. All governors and trustees recruited through Inspiring Governance receive 12 months worth of free support from us at the NGA, and I'll talk about the detail of that a bit later. And you can use the Inspiring Governance website at inspiringgovernance.org to register your vacancy, make connections with local volunteers and invite them to an interview. So moving on to the appointment process. So this is the bit where you start to work towards potentially getting people onto your board. I would argue that most of a traditional process can be conducted in a virtual environment by phone, email and video. Maybe email isn't potentially the best place to have any sort of dialogue, but it certainly can be used to make arrangements. I think the bit that is harder to achieve and actually probably can't, it is impossible at the moment, is the school visit. And I think we'd all agree that that's a really important part of the appointment process. But this is where the school website can come into its own. When I'm talking to candidates for the Future Chair scheme, before I connect them with a school, I always send them a link to the school website, ask them to have a good browse around the website so they get a feel for the school, so they can say whether or not it's a school they'd like to talk to further. And they always come back and say it's given them a really good feel for the school, and they want to take it forward. There are some fabulous school websites that I've seen that even have some sort of virtual tour of the school building, but obviously it's not quite the same as going to the school when it's full of students, but it can be a bit of a substitute. So those face-to-face and formal meetings and interviews are still possible, and using all sorts of different online tools that are now readily available. Your due diligence, requesting references and scanning social media, I'm guessing that is never done anymore on paper or by the post. You use email, and social media obviously is all online. And yes, so it's still perfectly possible to do a quick check of people and what they might have said in the past on social media, which can be quite influential in your decisions. In terms of the appointment, actually, when you get to the point of making that decision to appoint a new governor, those decisions can be made in a virtual board meeting. I think there are some considerations there, depending on how you normally do this. On my board, we always have an open vote. We have the candidate attend. They're asked to give a personal statement. Any governors that have not so far been involved in the interview process have the option to ask a question, and then the candidate steps out of the room while we have a quick discussion and take a vote, and then the candidate's brought back in. And at that point, I've never had anybody that's not been appointed. They're appointed, they then join the board and take full part in the meeting from that point on. Some boards do a closed ballot or a closed vote for that decision, which is perfectly fine. You just need to think through how you go about doing that. Perhaps a solution to that is, I mean, you could use the poll system. Then this is on GoToWebinar. There is a meeting version. Whether that has the same poll functionality, I don't know. But I mean, that is quite a simple process where you could use that. Or if the clerk was running the meeting, they could capture that voting through that, and that would be confidential. Or something a bit more simple, maybe everybody could send a text message to the clerk with their vote, and then the clerk can, in the same way they would collect in little bits of paper in a closed ballot, they would do the same just by text message. It would help to preserve that confidentiality if you don't want governors to know how others have voted. And you also need to think if the candidate is actually attending, how they leave the room. And maybe, yes, it's perfectly possible to leave the meeting in a virtual environment, but how do you ask them to come back? And maybe again, text message to let them know that you've concluded the discussion, you've made a decision, and you invite them to come back into the meeting. I just wanted to say something briefly about parent governance. I know that our advice team have had some questions about this. There's nothing in the legislation or statutory guidance that says you can't conduct an election for parent governor electronically. But there are some things to think about that you need to make sure that you've just ensured are in place. So every parent must have the opportunity to either be nominated or to nominate somebody else. They must all have the option to vote, and you must make sure that any parent that votes doesn't vote again. And there is obviously some confidentiality around that must be preserved. There are potentially some online tools that would help you to do this. For example, in my work, I have used something called Doodle Poll. I've not used that in a voting situation, but it has allowed me to collect availability information from a number of individuals. Whether that provides the security around confidentiality or not, I don't know, you need to look into that, but it is possible to do perhaps. What our advice team have been telling people that have asked about this is that if you've got parent governors with terms of office coming to an end quite soon, it's perfectly okay to temporarily extend their term of office until such time as you can do an election through the normal method, maybe once the schools opened again. Okay, I'm going to pause there and ask you to take part in another poll. Just select the right one, that would help, wouldn't it? There we go. So let's launch that poll. So on this one, we're just interested in finding out what activities you're planning to do as a board virtually over the summer term. Obviously, we're sort of in the Easter holiday now, although schools are operating in very different ways. So I'd be interested to see what you're planning to do. I was speaking to a school in terms of future chairs only last week who had gone ahead with a virtual interview of a future chair candidate, and they then had a virtual meeting to appoint that individual, and are now progressing with induction, and they've done that very quickly. So it is possible to achieve. People are still getting their votes in, so just over half of you have voted. On my board, we have changed our meeting schedule, but we are still planning to meet 2, maybe 3 times over the summer term. So a couple of committees and certainly a full board meeting. We always have a strategic planning day, usually in June, and we're holding fire on that. We're just seeing how things go. We're not sure if we want to do that virtually. We could, but we don't know if we want to. So we might look to maybe delay that or move it into next term, into the autumn term, if that means that we'll be able to do that day as we have in the past. Okay, so we're getting up to just over the 80%. So a couple more seconds, and then I'm going to close that poll. There we go, let's close that. Okay, thank you for taking part in that. That's really helpful. And that is very interesting. So we've got 14% are planning to do a governor or trustee interview. 4% will be doing senior executive interviews, and I'm guessing that's very different in a virtual world. 16% are going to be doing head teacher performance management. 6% are already planning to do board evaluation review, that's fabulous, and 60% are planning to do a strategic planning meeting in the summer term. And that's fabulous. It's really helped to know what sort of activity is being planned for the summer term, and it's great to see that boards are planning to continue doing business as best they can in a virtual environment. Okay, so if we go back to the presentation. Okay, so let's have a look at some hints and tips in terms of conducting a virtual interview. So I'd say play to your board strengths. Who feels confident about using the technology, and ask those particular individuals to take part. Always have a dry run. I don't think it hurts to say that we did a couple of rehearsals for this webinar, so that we had a dry run and we could get familiar with the technology. Think about the position of your camera, what's in the background, and remember to look at the camera. And I'm still working on making sure I look at the camera, not looking at the screen. That's often a bit of a tricky one. Think about background noise. Is there a radio? Is there a TV? Clocks ticking and chiming. I did remember to go and stop the clock that's in the hallway that does chime on the half hour. And it's a little bit of a feature of my own board meetings, is that one of our governors sits in her dining room, and right behind her is a clock that has a very pleasant chime to it that we have to pause and just allow the clock to chip in, and then we can get back to business. Avoid interruptions. Let other members of the household know what you're doing. As I'm speaking to you, I'm aware that there's somebody banging on my front door because there's a delivery which I'm going to ignore. Typical, isn't it? They've had all day and they choose now to do that. Structure your virtual interview, so make sure you plan and allocate questions to particular individuals. I would say keep the question succinct if you can. I think when a question has a bit of a preamble to it, it often allows the question to get a little bit lost. I think that is more noticeable in a virtual meeting, so to try and keep those questions as succinct as you can. One idea is to consider a two-stage interview, maybe a more informal conversation just with the chair first, and then a second interview that might be more formal with more governors involved. And perhaps the virtual environment allows more governors to take part. I think when we've tried to do this at my school, it tends to delay the process when you're trying to get governors and candidates and your head teacher maybe all available at the same time to go into school. It sometimes drags on a bit. Maybe this will allow a more expedient process that does involve more governors. Think about how a radio interview is conducted. Obviously, you'll have a chair of the panel conducting the interview. Use people's names and actually draw people in at the right point. And it's also worth being aware that depending on individuals' internet providers, there might be some delays depending on their speeds and bandwidth. So sometimes just allow for that. Moving on to the induction process, this is where I'm going to come on to that DBS check. There has been some guidance from the government about this. They have relaxed that requirement for the visual ID check a little bit by saying it can be done by video call. But they're saying that if you do go ahead with that, then the person doing the check should ideally have the original photo ID documents with them when they do the visual check with the person who they're putting through the DBS. They're saying that you can do it through a scan that's then emailed to the school. That's not necessarily ideal, and they would then require the original documents to be presented the next time the individual can get into the school. Our advice team was saying only do that if you really need to, and it might be better to wait until the school's open and do what you normally do with a DBS check, but there is still the possibility of doing those if you really want to. I think a lot of the information that we provide to governors is very much electronic now, so that doesn't really change a great deal. So ask the clerk to send some introductory information by email, or if you have access to a cloud document store. But I have seen some boards that have a very comprehensive e-induction package. I always like to have an induction meeting with my new governors, and that obviously still be done in a virtual environment. Governor buddies can still be used. They can have video copies if they like, and have a chat and make sure that your new governors feel very welcome on your board, even though we can't meet physically yet. And inspiring governance induction support, and that's a really important feature that you can use if you're going to recruit through Inspiring Governance. This is where I said I'm going to talk about this in a bit more depth now. So this is free 12-month support and training to everybody who's recruited through Inspiring Governance. The top one, the Welcome to Governance and Welcome to MAP, we have a system to allow us to send those out in the post still, so those will still go out. Everything else there is written down, and you can see that for yourself. I'm not going to read it through. A couple of things I just want to highlight that are different from what you may have seen in the past is that from last week, it has been expanded so that the access to e-learning on Learning Link is now to the full range of modules, not just the 8 induction modules. And we've added in the option of booking a place on one of our regional conferences. Unfortunately, the spring ones a few weeks ago had to be cancelled, but we are working on a suite of regional conferences for the autumn term, obviously restrictions being lifted, allowing, of course. And in terms of the Young Governors Network, that's a partial online network, a partial meetings network, and obviously the meetings bit of that has been suspended until we sort of get back to some sort of normality. Okay, moving on to the final step, which is development. And yes, once you've got your new governors inducted, then you want them to do some development and get up to speed as quickly as possible. But I'm hoping that you're looking at development opportunities for all of your board members. And e-learning is obviously ideal for a virtual governance environment. And this is where NGA Learning Link really does come into its own. There are on Learning Link over 50 CPD accredited modules, plus some bite-sized just-in-time modules. There's an enormous range of governance topics, from some that are obviously more applicable to new governors, such as the key functions of governance and safeguarding, and some that are particularly relevant to certain governors who have particular responsibilities on your board around resources, finance, MAP governance, particular groups of pupils, etc. But there is an enormous range of modules there, and we are working on a plan, a 3-year plan, to upgrade and update the contents, a lot of those modules over the next 3 years, with some new content as well. So it is changing on a regular basis. And as well as being free for all Inspiring Governance new governors and trustees, it is a subscription service with prices starting now at £82 a year, giving access to all board members and the clerk. Okay, so it's just around about 4:30 now. So just to sort of bring you back to where we were at the beginning, this is the cycle that we've been talking about: evaluate, recruit, appoint, induct, and develop. And I think we've looked at how all of those can be adapted to work quite effectively in a virtual environment. It does permit governor recruitment to continue whilst we can't actually go into school, we can't meet face to face. And in terms of some resources that you might find useful, you can still download from our website Right People Around the Table, which is our generic guide to governor trustee recruitment. You can access the Gold line. At the moment, that has been opened up to all boards, not just the Gold member boards. Our associates at Inspiring Governance has developed some guidance for volunteers in terms of how to approach interviews in their school. And there are 2 guides that you'll find at that link. One giving some detail around actually how to prepare for an interview itself, but also what to think about in terms of a virtual interview as well. You can also find on our website our guidance and information about coronavirus, and also the recording of our first webinar on virtual governance delivered by my colleague Steve Edmonds, and that you can click on that link to find that recording. So now I'm going to have a look at your questions. Let's see what has come in. There's a lot of questions come in. Okay. There's an awful lot of questions. I was just going to click on one. Okay, we've asked previously, but can NGA Learning Link modules and NGA Skills Audit be linked? That's a very good question. I'll admit I don't have an answer to that, but that's obviously something we can look at. I'm thinking in terms of highlighting which modules would be appropriate to do once you've done a skills audit and looking to address any skills gaps you've got. Okay, so that's a very good question. That's something we'll take on board and look at. What's that one there? What is the subscription price for the NGA Learning Link? Misheard it. The prices start at £82, and that's the discounted rate for gold members. It is slightly high. I think the maximum price is 122, and that's for non-members, but there are discounts for member schools. And some schools get access to this through local authority service level agreement. And just see this time is ticking, so let's just have a look at one more. It's not scrolling. There it is. A very nice comment there from somebody I know very well. I won't mention his name and embarrass him, although perhaps it's me that's a bit more embarrassing saying loving the seagulls from the other white in the background. I must admit I hadn't noticed. A little bit focused on what I'm doing at the moment, but thank you very much for that. And let's just have a quick look. It keeps scrolling back up to the top, and I think probably what's best is I'll take those questions away. Somebody saying the seagulls were lovely. Well, thank you very much for that. Okay, well, I think we've sort of hit the 30-minute time point on there. I'm trying to find a non-seagull related question that I can, what's that one there? Can those appointed at the moment, are they full members if the DBS has not been done until school is open? Again, good question. I think the advice that our RISE team are giving out is yes, they are full members of the board, but you just need to be aware that they haven't had their DBS checked through, and that needs to be done as a priority once the school is open. Appreciate at the moment it might not be seen as a priority, but yes, they're a full voting member of the board. They have been appointed. You just need to think about what the DBS check actually means, and we can't physically go into school at the moment, so that's possibly one of the reasons why you would have a DBS check done. So yes, they are full-blown members of the board, but you just need to make sure that DBS check isn't forgotten. Okay, well, I'm going to sort of start to wrap this up now. So thank you very much for those questions. Thank you very much for attending, and thank you for the seagulls for chipping in as well. It's still a lovely evening here on the Isle of Wight. I think I'm going to go for my my single period of exercise now, and wind down from a busy week. I'm hoping that when I come back, there'll be a glass of wine with my name on it, and that maybe my partner will be home from work as well. So thank you very much for attending. Thank you for taking part and submitting your questions. Please stay safe, keep healthy, have a great Easter weekend, whatever you choose to do within the restrictions, and happy Easter to all of you. Thank you very much.